Tonight, we will journey through centuries of history, tracing the rise and fall of a civilization that reshaped the world. As night falls over the 7 hills where Rome once stood, we invite you to close your eyes and travel backward through time to a world where marble columns reached toward cloudless Mediterranean skies, where the scent of olive oil mingled with salt air, and where the footsteps of countless citizens echoed through paved streets that connected 3 continents. This is a story not of heroes or battles, but of daily life, of rhythms and routines, of stone and earth, and the countless hands that built an empire. The Roman Empire, stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of North Africa, from the forests of Germania to the ancient cities of the East, was more than conquest and political power. It was a tapestry woven from thousands of communities, each with its own customs and traditions, unified by roads, laws, and a shared sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. Long before emperors crowned themselves in purple, before legions marched across distant frontiers, there existed a simple settlement on the banks of the Tiber River. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the mid-8th century before our Common Era, clusters of thatched huts dotted the Palatine Hill, one of 7 hills that would eventually cradle the eternal city. The year traditionally given for Rome's founding is 753 before the Common Era, a date calculated centuries later by Roman scholars who sought to anchor their civilization in mythic time. These early inhabitants were not yet Romans in any meaningful sense. They were Latin peoples, farmers and herders who worked the fertile volcanic soil, who built their shelters from timber and thatch, and who buried their dead in the valleys between the hills. The land itself shaped their lives. The Tiber flooded seasonally, transforming low-lying areas into impassable marshes, yet also depositing rich sediment that nourished crops. The 7 hills provided natural defensive positions, islands of safety in a landscape that could be treacherous. What we know of this earliest period comes not from written records, which did not yet exist, but from the patient work of archaeologists who have excavated layers of earth, uncovering fragments of pottery, remnants of post holes marking where wooden structures once stood, and the traces of ancient pathways worn smooth by countless feet. In the Roman Forum, that great public space that would later become the political and religious heart of Rome, excavations have revealed structures dating to the 7th century before the Common Era. Among these findings, archaeologists discovered a glass vessel inscribed with the word rex, meaning king, tangible evidence of the monarchical government that governed early Rome. Nearby, beneath black marble that was placed there in later centuries, they found an inscription on what is known as the lapis niger, believed to contain an ancient law. These fragments, weathered and incomplete, whisper of a time when Rome was ruled by kings, when its territory extended no further than a few miles from the city center, when its population numbered in the thousands rather than millions. The earliest structures were humble. Homes were typically circular or rectangular huts, with walls made of wattle and daub, wooden frameworks filled with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung that dried hard in the Mediterranean sun. Roofs were thatched with reeds gathered from the marshy areas near the river. Inside these dwellings, life was simple. Families cooked over open hearths, the smoke escaping through holes in the roof. They slept on platforms or mats, stored grain in large ceramic vessels, and kept what few possessions they owned in wooden chests. The smell of wood smoke would have been ever present, mingling with the earthy odor of damp clay and the pungent scent of livestock kept in pens near the homes. At night, the settlement would have been dark, save for the flickering light of hearth fires visible through doorways and the occasional torch carried by someone moving between dwellings. The sounds would have been those of any agricultural community: the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, dogs barking in the distance, and the murmur of voices speaking in archaic Latin, a language that would evolve over centuries into the classical tongue known to history. By the 7th century before the Common Era, significant changes were transforming this hilltop settlement. The Forum, previously a marshy depression between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, was being systematically drained. Engineers, likely influenced by the more advanced Etruscan civilization to the north, constructed an elaborate drainage system known as the Cloaca Maxima, a covered sewer that channeled water into the Tiber. This feat of early engineering allowed the Forum to be paved, transforming it from unusable wetland into a public gathering space. The paving itself was initially made of beaten earth, later replaced with gravel, and eventually with stone. Along this newly accessible ground, Romans began erecting their first significant public buildings. The Comitium, an open-air assembly area where citizens could gather, took shape around 650 to 630 before the Common Era. Near it stood the Regia, traditionally considered the house of the kings, along with the house of the Vestal Virgins and the Domus Publica, the residence of the high priest. These structures, though primitive by later standards, represented a crucial transition from scattered settlement to organized city. Centuries earlier, but in the same geographic region, the Etruscans had developed sophisticated hydraulic engineering techniques. Their civilization, flourishing in central Italy, had mastered the art of underground water management, constructing tunnels and drainage channels that controlled water flow through their cities. They were also among the first in the Italian peninsula to employ the arch in construction, a structural innovation that would become synonymous with Roman engineering. As Rome grew, it absorbed these techniques, learning from neighbors whose cities boasted amenities that hilltop Rome could only aspire to. The influence flowed not through conquest in these early days, but through observation, trade, and the movement of craftsmen who carried their skills from one settlement to another. Roman engineers studied Etruscan methods, adapting them to their own needs, gradually accumulating the knowledge that would later enable them to build structures of unprecedented scale and durability. The Roman kingdom, as this early period is known, lasted until 509 before the Common Era. During these 2.5 centuries, tradition holds that 7 kings ruled Rome, though historians note that the historical accuracy of these accounts is uncertain, as they were recorded centuries after the events they describe. What is more certain is the social structure that emerged during this time. Roman society divided itself into distinct groups. The patricians, members of Rome's oldest and wealthiest families, controlled most of the land and held the majority of political power. They were the aristocracy, claiming descent from the city's founding families, and they jealously guarded their privileges. Below them were the plebeians, the common people who made up the majority of the population. Plebeians were farmers, artisans, and laborers, citizens of Rome, but excluded from the highest political offices and from intermarriage with patricians. This social division, based not on wealth alone, but on birth and ancestry, would define Roman society for centuries, creating tensions that would drive much of Rome's internal political development. Unbeknownst to those who lived through it, the year 509 before the Common Era would mark a turning point in Roman history. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, was expelled from Rome, an event that Romans would commemorate for centuries afterward. The reasons for this expulsion, like much from this period, are obscured by legend and later propaganda, but the result was clear. Rome transformed itself from a monarchy into a republic. The word republic derives from res publica, meaning public thing or public affair, reflecting a new conception of government as belonging to the people rather than to a single ruler. This did not mean democracy in the modern sense. Rome would never be a democracy. Instead, it developed a complex system of government that mixed elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and popular participation, a constitutional arrangement that would evolve and adapt over nearly 5 centuries. At the center of the Republican government stood the Senate, an assembly of elder statesmen, typically numbering around 300 members, though this number would fluctuate over time. The Senate was not an elected body in the way we might understand it today. Rather, membership was largely determined by having held certain political offices. Former magistrates, those who had served as consuls, praetors, or other officials, were appointed to the Senate by censors, officials tasked with conducting the census and maintaining the role of senators. Once appointed, a senator held his position for life unless removed for moral or financial failings. These men, drawn almost exclusively from patrician families in the early Republic, wore togas with broad purple stripes and maroon shoes, visible markers of their status. They gathered in the Curia, the Senate House, a rectangular building in the Forum where they debated matters of state, sitting on wooden benches arranged along the walls. The interior would have been dimly lit, with natural light filtering through high windows and doorways, the air often thick with the scent of torch smoke and the body heat of hundreds of men in woolen garments. The Senate possessed no direct legal authority to pass laws, yet it wielded enormous influence. It issued decrees known as Senatus Consulta, officially framed as advice to magistrates, but in practice these recommendations were almost always followed. The Senate controlled Rome's finances, managing the treasury, and deciding how public funds would be allocated. It supervised the construction of roads, aqueducts, and temples, those monumental projects that would come to define Roman civilization. It directed foreign policy, receiving ambassadors from other states, negotiating treaties, and determining when and where Rome would wage war. It assigned military commands, deciding which generals would lead which campaigns, and it granted or withheld the triumph, the elaborate public celebration awarded to victorious commanders. Perhaps most importantly, the Senate possessed auctoritas, a Latin term meaning something more than mere authority, a moral weight, a prestige based on wisdom and experience that gave its decisions a force beyond any written law. Yet the Senate did not govern alone. The Roman constitution, unwritten and evolving, balanced senatorial power with that of elected magistrates and popular assemblies. At the apex of the magisterial hierarchy stood the 2 consuls, elected annually by the people. These men, always drawn from the patrician class in the early Republic, held imperium, the supreme executive power that included military command and the authority to convene the Senate and assemblies. Each consul could veto the actions of the other, a system designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power. Below the consuls were praetors, who administered civil law and commanded armies, censors, who conducted the census and oversaw public morals, aediles, who managed Rome's streets, markets, and public games, and quaestors, who handled financial matters. This cursus honorum, the ladder of offices, defined the career path of ambitious Roman men, each position requiring a minimum age and interval between offices, ensuring that power remained distributed and that leadership came from experienced hands. Meanwhile, in another region of the Mediterranean world, the distinction between patricians and plebeians was creating pressure that would fundamentally reshape Roman society. The plebeians, though citizens and liable for military service, found themselves shut out of political power and burdened by debts that could reduce them to near slavery. In the early 5th century before the Common Era, tensions erupted. Plebeians, threatening to secede from Rome entirely and establish their own city, forced the patricians to grant concessions. Among the most significant was the creation of the tribunate, a new office held by plebeians themselves. Tribunes possessed the power to veto actions of magistrates and even decrees of the Senate, a revolutionary check on patrician authority. They could summon the Senate and propose legislation to the plebeian assembly. Most remarkably, their persons were declared sacrosanct. Anyone who harmed a tribune could be killed with impunity. This sacred inviolability gave tribunes extraordinary leverage, transforming them into protectors of plebeian interests within the heart of Roman government. The struggle between patricians and plebeians continued for generations, each side winning concessions, creating new institutions, and gradually blurring the sharp distinction that had once seemed immutable. Between 449 and 450 before the Common Era, Rome codified its laws in the 12 Tables, bronze tablets erected in the Forum where all could read them. This act, simple in concept but revolutionary in effect, meant that law was no longer the secret knowledge of patrician priests, but public information accessible to all citizens. The specific provisions covered property rights, inheritance, marriage, debt, and criminal penalties, creating a legal framework that bound patricians and plebeians alike. Soon afterward, in 445 before the Common Era, the ban on intermarriage between the classes was lifted. By the late 4th century, plebeians had gained the right to hold all political offices, including the consulship. The distinction between patrician and plebeian persisted. It was, after all, a matter of birth and blood, but it had lost its absolute political meaning. Rome had transformed itself from an oligarchy into what might be called an elective aristocracy, where talent and wealth, rather than ancestry alone, determined one's place in society. As the Republic matured, Rome expanded beyond the 7 hills. The conquest of Italy, accomplished gradually over 2.5 centuries, was less a planned campaign than a series of defensive wars, opportunistic annexations, and strategic alliances that eventually brought the entire Italian peninsula under Roman control. By 264 before the Common Era, Rome dominated Italy from the Po Valley in the north to the Greek cities in the south. This expansion was not merely military. Rome developed a sophisticated system of incorporating conquered peoples, offering some the full rights of citizenship, granting others Latin rights, a partial citizenship that included commercial privileges and legal protections, and binding still others as allies required to provide troops, but otherwise left to govern themselves. This flexibility, this willingness to share the benefits of Roman identity, however unequally, created a reservoir of manpower and loyalty that would sustain Rome through centuries of war. The physical transformation of Rome mirrored its political evolution. Where once there had been thatched huts, now stood buildings of stone and tile. The Forum, that drained marsh, had become the center of Roman life, surrounded by temples, basilicas, and shops. The Temple of Saturn, one of the oldest structures in the Forum, served both as a religious shrine and as the state treasury, its vaults holding Rome's gold and silver reserves. Animal sacrifices were performed before its doors, the smoke of burning meat rising toward the sky, while priests chanted prayers and augurs examined the entrails for signs of divine favor. The Comitium, where citizens gathered for public assemblies, saw crowds of thousands when important votes were held, men arranged in their centuries and tribes according to complex procedures that gave greater weight to the votes of the wealthy. The Basilica, a covered hall supported by columns, provided shelter for legal proceedings and commercial transactions, its interior echoing with the voices of lawyers arguing cases, merchants negotiating deals, and the general murmur of public business. Beyond the Forum, the city spread outward in an increasingly dense jumble of buildings. Wealthy Romans built spacious homes on the hills, seeking elevation to escape the noise, smells, and summer heat of the lower city. These domus, as they were called, were inward-looking structures organized around a central courtyard called an atrium, where rainwater collected in a shallow pool. Rooms opened off this courtyard, cubicula for sleeping, a tablinum serving as the master's office, a triclinium for dining. The walls were plastered and painted with frescoes depicting mythological scenes, garden landscapes, or geometric patterns. Floors in the wealthier homes were decorated with mosaics, intricate images formed from thousands of tiny colored stone cubes. The air in these homes would have been perfumed with incense and oil lamps, the latter casting a warm, flickering light that softened the hard edges of marble and plaster. In the summer heat, thick walls and high ceilings kept interiors cool, while in winter, braziers burning charcoal provided warmth, though never quite enough to banish the chill entirely. Poorer Romans lived in very different circumstances. Multi-story apartment buildings called insulae crowded the valleys and lower slopes, housing the majority of Rome's population in cramped, poorly constructed tenements. These buildings, often 5 or 6 stories tall, were notoriously dangerous, prone to collapse from shoddy construction and vulnerable to fire. Most apartments were single rooms, or at most 2, with no running water and no cooking facilities beyond a small brazier. Residents fetched water from public fountains, carried it up narrow stairways, and dumped waste into jars that were periodically emptied into pits or the street. The interiors of these apartments were dark, stuffy in summer, and drafty in winter. The smell of unwashed bodies, cooking odors, and human waste would have been inescapable. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Families lived, cooked, and slept in the same small space, separated from neighbors only by thin walls through which every sound passed freely. Yet this was home for most Romans, the reality of urban life in an ancient city that had grown far beyond any original plan. Unbeknownst to the Romans themselves, the patterns of their daily lives followed rhythms dictated by the sun and the seasons, rhythms that would remain essentially unchanged from the Republic through the height of the empire. Romans rose at dawn, or even before, when the first gray light touched the eastern sky. Breakfast, if taken at all, was a light affair. Bread dipped in wine, perhaps some cheese or olives, maybe dried fruit. By sunrise, work had begun. For farmers in the countryside, this meant tending crops, caring for livestock, repairing tools and buildings. For urban craftsmen, it meant opening shops, lighting furnaces, setting out goods for sale. For laborers, it meant reporting to construction sites where new roads, aqueducts, or buildings were always being built. For the wealthy, morning was the time for clients to call upon patrons, a ritualized exchange where humble citizens paid their respects to powerful men, receiving in return small gifts of money or food, and more importantly, political support and legal protection. This patron-client relationship formed invisible threads connecting Roman society, creating networks of obligation and loyalty that transcended the formal structures of government. Work ended around noon, when the sun reached its zenith and the heat became oppressive. The Romans did not observe a weekly day of rest. Instead, their calendar was punctuated by feriae, festival days when business ceased and the population devoted itself to religious observances and public entertainment. On ordinary days, however, the afternoon belonged to leisure. This was when Romans visited the baths, vast public complexes that served as much more than places to wash. The thermae, as these bathhouses were called, were architectural marvels, requiring enormous quantities of water, delivered by aqueducts and heated by furnaces, tended by teams of slaves. The typical bath complex contained a series of rooms, each with a different temperature. The frigidarium with its cold pool, the tepidarium with warm water, and the caldarium, the hot bath where steam condensed on marble walls and bathers reclined in near scalding water. But the baths offered more than bathing. They included gardens for strolling, colonnaded walkways where people gathered to talk, open spaces for exercise where men played ball games or wrestled, and even libraries and lecture halls. Entry cost a mere fraction of a day's wages, making the baths accessible to nearly all free citizens. Here, more than perhaps anywhere else in Roman society, class distinctions blurred. Senators bathed alongside shopkeepers, soldiers alongside scribes, all naked and equal in the universal ritual of cleanliness. Meanwhile, in the regions beyond Italy, Roman expansion was creating the conditions for unprecedented growth and transformation. The Punic Wars, a series of conflicts with Carthage that spanned more than a century, ended with Rome in control of Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, most of Spain, and the coast of North Africa. Wars in the east brought Greece, Macedonia, and eventually much of Asia Minor under Roman authority. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Rome's territory stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River, from North Africa to the Alps. This expansion created enormous wealth as tribute from conquered territories and the spoils of war flowed into Rome. It also created massive social disruption. Small farmers, conscripted for years-long military campaigns, returned home to find their land neglected and their families in debt. Many sold their farms to wealthy landowners who consolidated holdings into vast estates worked by slaves, prisoners of war, who now numbered in the hundreds of thousands. These displaced farmers migrated to Rome and other cities, swelling the urban population and creating a volatile class of landless poor, dependent on grain distributions and public entertainment to keep them pacified. The late Republic was a time of crisis, though Romans did not yet understand that their traditional system of government was collapsing. Ambitious generals, commanding armies loyal to them personally rather than to the Senate used military victories to gain political power. The old checks and balances that had maintained equilibrium for centuries proved inadequate against men who commanded legions and possessed the wealth of provinces. Civil wars erupted, devastating Italy and the provinces, as rival factions struggled for supremacy. The details of these conflicts, the specific battles and personalities, matter less to our story than their cumulative effect: the destruction of the Republic and the emergence of a new form of government, one in which a single individual held supreme power while maintaining the fiction of republican institutions. In 27 before the Common Era, Octavian, who would take the name Augustus, became Rome's first emperor. He claimed to have restored the Republic, returning power to the Senate and people. In reality, he held control of the army, the provinces where legions were stationed, and Rome's finances. The Senate remained, its members still wearing their purple-striped togas, still gathering in the Curia to debate. But their debates now concerned matters the emperor permitted them to discuss. The popular assemblies continued to meet, but their role in electing magistrates gradually withered as the emperor assumed the power to nominate and effectively appoint officials. This transformation from republic to empire was neither sudden nor obvious. Augustus carefully maintained the outward forms of the old constitution, even as he concentrated real power in his own hands. Future emperors would be less circumspect, but the pattern was established. Rome would be ruled by emperors, and the empire itself would be the government that these emperors administered. The Roman Empire at its height in the early 2nd century of the Common Era was a geographical and political entity of staggering scale. It encompassed approximately 5 million square kilometers, with a population estimated between 55 and 100 million people, perhaps 20% of humanity at that time. The Mediterranean Sea, which Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea, lay at its center, an internal highway connecting territories that stretched across 3 continents. In the north, the empire's border followed the Rhine and Danube rivers, beyond which lay the forests of Germania, home to tribes that Romans considered barbarians. In Britain, the northern frontier was marked by Hadrian's Wall, a stone barrier stretching from coast to coast across the narrowest part of the island. In the east, the empire's boundary ran along the Euphrates River in Syria, facing the Parthian and later Sassanid empires, Rome's principal rivals. In the south, the empire controlled the entire North African coast, from Egypt through Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and into Morocco, with the Sahara Desert forming a natural southern boundary. This vast territory was divided into provinces, administrative units governed by officials appointed either by the Senate or by the emperor. Senatorial provinces, typically older and more peaceful territories, were governed by proconsuls, former consuls appointed for 1-year terms. Imperial provinces, often frontier regions requiring significant military presence, were governed by legates appointed by the emperor and serving at his pleasure. These governors wielded enormous power within their provinces. They commanded troops, collected taxes, administered justice, and oversaw the construction of roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. They were supported by small staffs of clerks, legal advisors, and financial officers. But the scale of their responsibilities was immense. A governor might travel hundreds of miles to hear legal cases, adjudicate disputes between cities, or inspect military installations along the frontier. Their decisions could affect millions of people, yet they served without salaries, expected to fund their own expenses from the revenues they collected or from personal wealth. Centuries earlier, but now serving as the foundation for the empire's administration, Romans had begun constructing the network of roads that would become one of their most enduring achievements. The first major road, the Via Appia, was built in 312 before the Common Era, connecting Rome to Capua and eventually extending to Brundisium on the Adriatic coast. Over subsequent centuries, roads spread across Italy and then throughout the provinces, creating a transportation network of unprecedented extent. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, more than 50,000 miles of paved roads connected the empire's far-flung territories. These were not simple dirt tracks. Roman roads were carefully engineered structures built to last centuries. Construction began with excavation of a trench 3 feet deep, which served as the base. The bottom was lined with mortar, upon which were laid 4 distinct layers of masonry, large stones bound with cement or clay, followed by 10 inches of rammed concrete, then 12 to 18 inches of layered concrete, and finally, a surface of large polygonal stone blocks, each 1 to 3 feet in diameter and 8 to 12 inches thick. The surface was slightly cambered, tilted toward the edges to allow water to drain off. These roads ran straight whenever possible, climbing hills rather than detouring around them, crossing rivers on stone bridges supported by arches. They were wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, with marked milestones indicating distances to the nearest cities. Along them moved not only the legions, marching with mechanical precision, but also merchants with their goods, official couriers carrying messages, pilgrims visiting distant shrines, and ordinary travelers journeying from one part of the empire to another. Unbeknownst to later generations who would marvel at these roads, they were complemented by an equally impressive system for delivering water to Roman cities. Aqueducts, channels that brought fresh water from distant springs and rivers, supplied Rome and provincial cities with the constant flow necessary for fountains, baths, latrines, and private homes. The engineering challenges were formidable. Water flows only downhill, so aqueduct channels had to maintain a constant, gentle slope, typically about 1 in 200, across distances that could exceed 50 miles. The channel itself, called the spicus, was usually built underground, following the contours of the landscape, occasionally tunneling through hills when necessary. Where valleys intervened, the channel was elevated on bridgework, creating the iconic arcaded structures that have survived to the present day. The Pont de Gare in southern France, for example, stands nearly 50 meters tall, carrying water across the Garden River Valley on 3 tiers of stone arches. The aqueduct channel that it supported was just a covered trench barely a meter wide, yet it delivered thousands of cubic meters of water per day to the city of Nemausus. Rome itself was supplied by 11 aqueducts by the height of the empire, delivering approximately 1,000 cubic meters of water daily. This was a per capita consumption rate comparable to modern cities. Most of this water went to public use. The baths, the public fountains where ordinary citizens drew their water, the latrines, and an elaborate sewer system that carried waste out of the city. Water that reached private homes was a privilege granted to the wealthy or awarded as an honor by the state. The aqueducts themselves were protected by law. Tampering with them, diverting their water without authorization, or polluting their flow were serious crimes. Yet in rural areas, farmers regularly tapped aqueducts during the growing season. an illegal practice that authorities largely tolerated because it helped keep food prices low and because agriculture was the foundation of Rome's economy. In another region of the empire, where North Africa's coastline met the Mediterranean, Romans had established cities that mirrored Rome itself in organization, if not in scale. These provincial cities varied widely in their origins. Some were ancient settlements that Rome had conquered. Others were colonies established for retired soldiers. Still others grew organically around military camps or trading posts. Despite their diversity, they shared common features. Each had a forum, a central public square surrounded by temples, a basilica for legal proceedings, and shops. Each had baths, often multiple complexes varying in size and luxury. Larger cities had amphitheaters for gladiatorial games, theaters for dramatic performances, and circuses for chariot races. They had paved streets laid out in a grid, water supplied by aqueducts, sewers to carry away waste. The architecture was distinctly Roman, built with concrete and stone, employing arches and vaults, decorated with columns in the Greek orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. Yet these cities were not merely copies of Rome. They incorporated local materials, adapted to local climates, and accommodated local customs and deities alongside the worship of Rome's gods and the imperial cult. The climate of the Mediterranean world during the height of the Roman Empire was, according to recent paleoclimate research, warmer and more stable than the centuries that preceded or followed it. This period, sometimes called the Roman climate optimum, lasted roughly from the beginning of the Common Era until about 500. Mediterranean temperatures during this time were approximately 2 degrees Celsius warmer than the preceding centuries. The sea surface temperature in the Mediterranean was notably higher, creating conditions that were generally favorable for agriculture across much of the empire's core territories. Warm temperatures and reliable rainfall, at least in most years, meant that crops flourished, harvests were abundant, and the population could be fed without the catastrophic famines that had plagued earlier periods and would return in later centuries. This climatic stability, though Romans themselves were unaware of it as a distinct phenomenon, may have contributed to the empire's prosperity and expansion. Warm weather allowed grain cultivation in regions that would later become marginal. Extended growing seasons permitted 2 harvests per year in some areas, and the generally favorable conditions supported the population growth that filled Rome's cities and supplied its armies. The Roman diet, shaped by climate and geography, centered on grains and legumes, which provided the bulk of daily calories for most of the population. Wheat was the preferred grain, milled into flour and baked into bread. The wealthy ate bread made from refined wheat flour, while the poor made do with darker bread baked from barley or emmer wheat, or even porridge made from millet. Legumes, lentils, chickpeas, broad beans, peas, were cultivated widely and stored for use during the winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. They were cooked into stews, mixed with vegetables, and when available, small pieces of meat. Olive oil was ubiquitous, used for cooking, as fuel for lamps, and even as a form of soap. Wine was the standard beverage, consumed diluted with water, as drinking wine unmixed was considered barbaric. The wealthy supplemented this basic diet with meat, pork, lamb, game birds, even exotic items like dormice and flamingo tongues, prized for their rarity rather than their taste. They ate fish and shellfish, especially oysters, which were farmed in coastal areas and transported inland packed in snow. Fresh vegetables, lettuce, cabbage, Onions, leeks, cucumbers appeared on tables when in season, while dried or preserved versions sustained people through the winter. Fruit, particularly apples, pears, grapes, figs, and dates, was eaten fresh or dried. Honey was the only sweetener, used generously in both sweet and savory dishes. The main meal of the day, called the cena, was eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, after the day's work and the visit to the baths. For the wealthy, this was a formal affair, conducted in the triclinium, a dining room furnished with 3 couches arranged in a U-shape around a low table. Diners reclined on these couches, propped on their left elbows, eating with their right hands. Slaves brought course after course, each dish more elaborate than the last, accompanied by wine that flowed freely as the evening progressed. Entertainment might include musicians playing the lyre, poets reciting verses, or even acrobats and dancers performing between courses. The food itself was heavily seasoned, with complex sauces made from garum, a fermented fish sauce that was a staple of Roman cooking, combined with herbs, spices, wine, honey, and vinegar. The goal seemed to be to disguise the natural flavor of food, creating taste combinations that were simultaneously sweet, salty, sour, and pungent. Some Romans complained that these elaborate preparations were unhealthy, but they continued to be popular among those who could afford them. For the poor, the cena was a much simpler meal, usually consisting of porridge or bread with whatever vegetables, legumes, or small amount of cheese or meat the family could afford. It was eaten at home, in the cramped confines of an apartment, or purchased from one of the many food shops that lined Rome's streets. Recent archaeological evidence from Pompeii has revealed that even the poor occasionally ate meat, purchasing it from restaurants and street vendors who served simple, inexpensive meals. The diet of slaves was even more restricted, typically consisting of a grain allowance, sometimes supplemented with legumes or vegetables, and, on rare occasions, meat. This monotonous diet provided sufficient calories for heavy labor, but little else, contributing to the poor health and short lifespans typical of enslaved populations throughout the empire. Slavery was fundamental to Roman society and economy, so pervasive that it became nearly invisible to those who benefited from it. Estimates suggest that at various points, slaves may have constituted 20 to 30% of the population in Italy, with lower but still significant percentages in the provinces. People became slaves through several routes. The most common was war. Defeated enemies were enslaved in vast numbers, marched to Rome or provincial cities, and sold in slave markets. Others were born into slavery, the children of enslaved mothers. Still others were enslaved as punishment for crimes, or sold themselves or their children into slavery to escape crushing debts. Slaves had no legal rights. They were property, bought and sold like livestock, subject to their owner's absolute authority, including the power of life and death. They could be beaten, sexually exploited, or killed with impunity, though Roman law gradually imposed some minimal protections and customs frowned upon excessive cruelty. Slaves performed every imaginable task. In the countryside, they worked in fields and vineyards, in mines and quarries, under conditions that were often brutal and deadly. In cities, they served as domestic servants, cooks, cleaners, nursemaids, and personal attendants. Skilled slaves worked as craftsmen, physicians, teachers, and accountants, their training making them valuable assets that owners might rent out for profit. Some slaves achieved positions of considerable responsibility. managing estates, running businesses, or serving as secretaries to powerful men, even emperors. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, was common enough in Roman society that freedmen and freedwomen formed a distinct social class. Masters freed slaves for various reasons: as a reward for faithful service, to fulfill provisions in a will, or simply out of affection. A freed slave became a libertus or liberta, gaining Roman citizenship, but retaining certain obligations to their former master, who became their patron. Freedmen could own property, conduct business, and even become wealthy. Though they faced social stigma and were barred from holding certain political offices, their children, however, were full citizens with no legal disabilities, allowing families to rise in status over generations. This practice of manumission, unusual in slave societies, created a mechanism for social mobility and helped integrate enslaved populations into Roman society, providing incentives for cooperation and diminishing the likelihood of large-scale slave revolts. Centuries earlier, but continuing as a central aspect of Roman culture throughout the imperial period, marriage and family life followed patterns that reflected Rome's values and social structure. Marriage in Roman society was fundamentally a partnership, its primary purpose the production of legitimate children who would inherit property and continue the family line. Romans practiced marital monogamy. A person could have only one spouse at a time, though divorce and remarriage were relatively common and socially acceptable. Marriages were typically arranged by families, with fathers negotiating matches for their children. The bride brought a dowry, usually money or property, which technically remained hers, but was controlled by her husband during the marriage and returned if the marriage ended. The ideal age for marriage was mid-20s for men, who needed time to establish themselves economically and politically, and early teens for women, who were expected to begin bearing children as soon as they were physically mature. The wedding itself was a complex ritual, incorporating elements that have persisted in Western marriage ceremonies to the present day. An engagement might be formalized with a ring, worn on the third finger of the left hand, based on the belief that a nerve ran directly from that finger to the heart. The wedding date was carefully chosen, avoiding certain months and days considered unlucky. The bride wore a special dress, typically white or off-white, with a flame-colored veil and yellow shoes. Her hair was arranged in a particular style, divided into 6 locks and bound with ribbons. The ceremony itself could take several forms, but typically involved the couple joining hands before witnesses, exchanging vows, and making sacrifices to the household gods. Afterward came a feast, often held at the bride's family home, featuring elaborate food and entertainment. At the ceremony's conclusion, the groom symbolically kidnapped his bride, carrying her over the threshold of his home to protect her from evil spirits that might lurk there. The new wife then smeared animal fat on the doorposts, another protective ritual, before entering her new home. Within the household, the Roman family was hierarchical and patriarchal. The paterfamilias, the male head of the household, held legal authority over all family members, including his wife, children, and even adult sons if he was still living. This patria potestas, or paternal power, gave him control over property and the right to arrange marriages, though by the late Republic and Empire, these powers were increasingly constrained by law and custom. The wife, while subordinate in legal terms, managed the household, overseeing slaves, organizing domestic tasks, and raising young children. Elite Roman women, unlike their Greek counterparts, participated in social life, attending banquets, going to public entertainments, and exerting influence through their relationships with powerful men. Some women achieved considerable wealth and independence, especially widows who inherited property from husbands and fathers, though they always operated under formal male guardianship. Children were raised strictly, with emphasis on duty, discipline, and respect for tradition. Boys from wealthy families received formal education, studying literature, rhetoric, and sometimes philosophy, preparing for careers in law, politics, or the military. Girls were educated at home, learning domestic skills and perhaps basic literacy, though some received more extensive education in literature and music. Children from poor families had little or no formal education, learning whatever skills they needed through apprenticeship or observation. Meanwhile, in the cities of the empire, public festivals provided regular breaks from routine and reinforced communal identity. The Roman calendar was punctuated with feriae, feast days, dedicated to various gods or commemorating important historical events. On these days, which occurred with remarkable frequency, perhaps 2 or 3 per week by some accounts, public business ceased, courts closed, and the population devoted itself to religious observance and celebration. Festivals typically began with processions to temples, where priests performed sacrifices, slaughtering animals before altars while chanting prayers. The meat from these sacrifices was distributed to the crowd, providing rare opportunities for poor citizens to eat meat. After religious ceremonies came entertainment, athletic competitions, theatrical performances, chariot races, or gladiatorial games, depending on the festival and the city's resources. These events were sponsored by the state or by wealthy individuals seeking popularity, and admission was free. The most important festivals had their own distinctive features. Saturnalia, celebrated in December, honored Saturn, god of agriculture. For several days, normal social hierarchies were suspended. Slaves ate with their masters, gifts were exchanged, gambling was permitted even though it was usually illegal, and the city gave itself over to revelry. Lupercalia, held in February, was a fertility festival associated with the god Faunus, featuring young men running through the streets, striking bystanders with strips of goat hide, believed to promote fertility. The Floralia in April celebrated the goddess Flora with theatrical performances and games, often featuring dancers and entertainments that respectable Romans considered scandalous but attended anyway. These festivals served multiple functions. They honored the gods, whose favor was essential for the community's welfare. They provided entertainment and relief from labor for a population that had no weekends or vacations. They reinforced social bonds, bringing together citizens from all classes in shared celebration. And they displayed the generosity of those who sponsored them, creating political capital that could be converted into electoral support or popular goodwill. Gladiatorial games, though not technically part of religious festivals, became one of the most distinctive forms of Roman entertainment. These contests, in which armed men fought each other or wild animals, usually to the death, originated as funeral rites intended to honor deceased nobles. Over time, they evolved into public spectacles staged in amphitheaters, the largest and most famous of which was the Colosseum in Rome. This massive structure, begun under the Emperor Vespasian and completed under Titus in 80 of the Common Era, could hold perhaps 50,000 spectators. Its design was sophisticated, with numbered entrances and a system of stairways and corridors, that allowed the entire crowd to enter or exit in minutes. Beneath the arena floor was a complex underground area, the hypogum, containing cages for animals, rooms for gladiators, and mechanical elevators that lifted fighters and beasts up to arena level through trap doors. The Colosseum could even be flooded for mock naval battles, at least in its early years before the hypogum was built. A retractable awning, operated by sailors using techniques adapted from maritime rigging, provided shade for spectators during performances. Unbeknownst to modern observers who see these games as barbaric, Romans understood them as demonstrations of virtues, virtuous courage, and as metaphors for the military valor that had built and sustained the empire. Gladiators were usually slaves or condemned criminals, though some were free men who volunteered for the fame and prize money. They trained in special schools, learning to fight with different types of weapons and armor: the heavily armed myrmillo, the lightly armed retiarius with his net and trident, the Thracian with his curved sword and small shield. They were valuable property, and most fights were not intended to be fatal, though the risk of death was always present. Successful gladiators became celebrities, their images sold on lamps and pottery, their names written on walls by admiring fans. The games themselves were complex events lasting all day. Morning featured animal hunts, with trained hunters facing lions, bears, elephants, or other exotic beasts imported from across the empire. Midday was reserved for executions, criminals condemned to death by animal or by gladiator, killed before the crowd as both punishment and entertainment. The afternoon brought the main events, the gladiatorial contests themselves, where matched pairs fought while the audience cheered their favorites, and the presiding official decided the fate of defeated fighters. The smell of blood and sweat, the roar of the crowd, the glint of sun on metal, the dust kicked up by struggling bodies. These were the sensory experiences of the games, spectacles that simultaneously horrified and thrilled those who witnessed them. In another corner of the empire, far from Rome, but following similar patterns of organization and culture, the Roman army maintained the frontiers and enforced the peace that made possible the prosperity of the interior provinces. The legion was the fundamental unit of the Roman army, a force of approximately 5,000 infantry, supplemented by cavalry and auxiliary troops. During the height of the empire, between 25 and 34 legions were distributed across the provinces, concentrated especially along the Rhine-Danube frontier and in the east facing Parthia. Each legion was a self-contained military unit, capable of independent operations, and including within its ranks not only soldiers, but craftsmen, engineers, surveyors, and medical personnel. Legionaries were Roman citizens who enlisted for terms of 25 years, receiving regular pay, bonuses, and upon retirement, either a land grant or a cash payment. They were professional soldiers, not citizen militia, and their training and discipline made them arguably the most effective military force of the ancient world. The internal organization of the legion was hierarchical and precise. The basic unit was the contubernium, a tent group of 8 men who lived, marched, and fought together. 10 contubernia formed a century, commanded by a centurion, one of the backbone positions of the Roman army. Centurions were career soldiers, promoted from the ranks based on merit, wielding absolute authority over their men. 6 centuries formed a cohort, and 10 cohorts comprised the legion, though the first cohort was double strength with 5 double-sized centuries. Each legion was commanded by a legatus, a senator appointed by the emperor, who served as both military commander and, in single legion provinces, as provincial governor. Below him were 6 military tribunes, including 1 broad-striped tribune, who served as second in command, and various specialist officers. The legion's standard, the aquila or eagle, was its sacred symbol, protected with fanatical devotion and never to be lost to the enemy. Legionaries spent more time building than fighting. When not on campaign, they constructed roads, bridges, aqueducts, and fortifications. They quarried stone, felled timber, operated mills, and manufactured much of their own equipment. The camps they built, whether temporary stopping points on the march or permanent bases for winter quarters, followed standardized layouts. Surrounded by ditches and palisades or stone walls, each camp was a miniature city with streets laid out in a grid, barracks for the soldiers, headquarters buildings, storehouses, workshops, and sometimes baths. Permanent frontier forts evolved into settlements, with civilian communities growing up outside the walls, populated by veterans, soldiers' families, merchants, and craftsmen who supplied the garrison. These settlements often developed into towns that survived long after the legions departed. Trade, facilitated by the roads, the aqueducts, the stable currency, and above all by the peace the legions enforced, connected the empire's diverse regions in a complex economic network. Raw materials flowed from the provinces to manufacturing centers and markets. Spain exported silver, lead, olive oil, wine, and the fermented fish sauce called garum. North Africa, especially Egypt, supplied grain, feeding Rome and other cities that could not produce enough food locally. Britain exported lead, tin, and woolen goods. Gaul produced wine, pottery, and metalwork. From the east came luxury goods, silk from China, transported along the Silk Road, spices from India and Southeast Asia, carried across the Indian Ocean and up the Red Sea, precious stones, perfumes, and fine textiles. These goods moved along established routes, overland along the Roman roads, by sea across the Mediterranean, and via coastal shipping, and on rivers using boats that carried bulk cargo more efficiently than wagons. The scale of this trade was substantial. Archaeological evidence includes shipwrecks loaded with amphorae, the large ceramic jars used to transport oil, wine, fish sauce, and grain. Thousands of these vessels have been found in the Mediterranean, providing tangible evidence of the volume of trade. Ports like Ostia, Rome's port city at the mouth of the Tiber, were bustling centers of commerce where goods from across the empire were unloaded, warehoused, and distributed. Merchants, many of them freedmen or provincials rather than old Roman families, organized this trade, financing voyages, maintaining networks of agents in distant cities, and accumulating fortunes that allowed them to build grand homes and sponsor public works. The state benefited through taxation. Goods crossing provincial boundaries paid customs duties, providing revenue that helped fund the army and administration. This economic integration, though less complete and sophisticated than modern global trade, was unprecedented in the ancient world and would not be matched again for more than a millennium. Centuries earlier, but preserved with extraordinary clarity in the archaeological record, 2 Roman cities on the Bay of Naples captured daily life in a way no other sites can match. On the 24th of August in 79 of the Common Era, Mount Vesuvius erupted with catastrophic force, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum under meters of volcanic ash and pyroclastic flows. The destruction was complete and rapid, giving residents no time to evacuate with more than what they could carry. Pompeii was buried under approximately 6 meters of ash and pumice, while Herculaneum was engulfed in superheated pyroclastic surges that carbonized organic material and killed instantly anyone who had not fled. These same destructive forces also preserved the cities in remarkable detail. Buildings remained largely intact, their walls still plastered and painted, their roofs collapsed, but their floor plans visible. Wooden furniture, usually long decayed at other sites, survived in carbonized form at Herculaneum, along with foodstuffs, papyrus scrolls, wax tablets, and textiles. Even the forms of human bodies were preserved, their shapes captured in the hardened ash where they fell. Excavations at these sites, ongoing for more than 2 centuries, have revealed aspects of Roman life that written sources rarely mention. Houses display the full range of wealth, from tiny single-room shops and apartments to sprawling mansions with elaborate gardens, multiple dining rooms, and private bath suites. The House of the Faun in Pompeii, one of the largest, occupied an entire city block and contained the famous Alexander mosaic, a floor decoration depicting Alexander the Great battling the Persians, made from approximately 2 million tiny stone pieces. The Villa of the Papyri, outside Herculaneum, housed a library of more than 1,800 papyrus scrolls, the only intact library from classical antiquity, though most remain unopened because they are too fragile to unroll. Streets preserve the ruts worn by wagon wheels, stepped crossings that allowed pedestrians to cross without stepping in street waste, and even the graffiti scratched or painted on walls by residents, ranging from political slogans to obscene jokes to declarations of love. Shops at these sites still contain the equipment used in ancient commerce. Bakeries have their mills, circular stones rotated by donkeys to grind flour, and ovens built into the walls. Wine shops have their counters with built-in jars for storing wine, which was ladled out to customers. Fulleries, where woolen cloth was cleaned and processed, have their treading vats where workers stomped on fabric in a mixture of water and urine, the ammonia serving as a cleaning agent. One establishment in Herculaneum preserved wooden racks still holding storage amphorae, evidence of how goods were organized for sale. The baths at both cities, multiple establishments ranging from modest to monumental, show the centrality of bathing to Roman life. The central baths at Herculaneum, never completed when the eruption occurred, were under construction, with their walls still being decorated when catastrophe struck. The food preserved at Herculaneum has allowed scientists to analyze the ancient diet with unusual precision. Analysis of carbonized remains shows bread made from various grains, fruit including figs and dates, nuts, vegetables, and fish. Study of human remains through isotope analysis reveals gender differences in diet, with men consuming more fish and grain, while women ate more meat, eggs, dairy, and vegetables, possibly reflecting status differences, since men generally held higher social positions than women. The presence of food from across the empire, imported spices, exotic fruits, wine from different regions, demonstrates the reach of trade networks even in these relatively small provincial cities. Unbeknownst to those who lived through the earlier, more prosperous centuries, the Roman Empire was entering a period of instability and transformation by the late 2nd century. Marcus Aurelius, often considered the last of the good emperors, died in 180 of the Common Era, succeeded by his son Commodus, who would be assassinated 12 years later. The century that followed, the 3rd century of the Common Era, was marked by political chaos, with emperors rapidly succeeding one another, often murdered by their own troops or defeated by rivals. Between 235 and 284, more than 50 men claimed the imperial title, most reigning only briefly before violent deaths. This constant instability weakened central authority, drained the treasury through endless civil wars, and left frontiers vulnerable to invasion. The army, supposedly the protector of the empire, became its greatest liability as legions proclaimed their own emperors and marched on Rome or rival claimants, devastating provinces and demanding ever larger donatives for their support. Economic troubles compounded political instability. The state debased the currency, reducing the silver content of coins to stretch limited resources, causing severe inflation that destroyed faith in money and disrupted trade. Tax collection became increasingly difficult and increasingly oppressive, as desperate emperors squeezed the population to fund armies and bribe potential rebels. Agricultural productivity declined in some regions, whether from overexploitation of soils, changing climate, or the disruption of war. The gap between rich and poor widened as wealth concentrated in the hands of a shrinking elite while the masses became increasingly impoverished. The curial class, the local aristocrats who traditionally administered cities and financed public works from their own wealth, found themselves crushed between demands from the central government and the inability of their communities to pay, leading many to abandon their positions and even their property to escape these burdens. Invasions across the frontiers, previously rare and usually contained, became regular occurrences in the 3rd century. Germanic tribes, pressed by population growth and movements of peoples further east, crossed the Rhine and Danube, raiding deep into imperial territory. The Goths sacked Athens in 267 and threatened multiple provinces. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire, more organized and aggressive than its Parthian predecessor, captured the Emperor Valerian in 260. This unprecedented humiliation, a Roman emperor taken prisoner and dying in captivity, symbolized Rome's vulnerability. The empire fractured temporarily, with breakaway states emerging in Gaul and the east, ruled by military strongmen who claimed to be protecting Roman interests, even as they defied central authority. Recovery came under soldier emperors like Aurelian, who reunited the empire and stabilized the frontiers, but at the cost of transforming Roman government into an explicitly military autocracy. Climatic changes, subtle and initially unremarked, were also affecting the empire during this period. The warm, stable climate of the Roman climate optimum began transitioning around 200 of the Common Era. Temperatures became more variable, with periodic cooling phases. Rainfall patterns shifted, with some regions experiencing drought while others faced flooding. These changes, occurring over decades and centuries, were too gradual for contemporaries to recognize as a distinct phenomenon, but their cumulative effects were significant. Agricultural yields declined in marginal areas. Water supplies in some cities became less reliable. The environmental stresses, combined with political instability and economic decline, may have contributed to increased mortality and the devastating impact of epidemics, such as the Antonine Plague in the late 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the mid-3rd century. These pandemics killed millions, depopulating cities, disrupting agriculture, and further weakening the empire's social and economic fabric. The 4th century brought renewed stability under Diocletian and Constantine, emperors who fundamentally restructured imperial administration. Diocletian divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor and subordinate Caesar, creating a system called the Tetrarchy that was intended to prevent civil wars and ensure orderly succession. Constantine, after defeating his rivals, reunited the empire under his sole rule and established Constantinople as a second capital in the east. A new Rome built on the site of ancient Byzantium. He also legalized Christianity and began the process of integrating this formerly persecuted religion into the official structures of the state, a transformation that would have profound long-term consequences. The administrative reforms of these emperors increased the number of provinces, separating military and civilian authority, creating larger bureaucracies to manage the more complex government, and fixing more of the population in place through laws that bound farmers to their land and craftsmen to their trades. Yet these reforms could not reverse the empire's fundamental challenges. The western provinces, less wealthy and urbanized than the east, faced greater pressure from barbarian incursions and found it increasingly difficult to fund the military necessary for defense. The eastern provinces, meanwhile, centered on the wealthy cities of Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. With their shorter frontiers and greater economic resources, proved more resilient. This growing imbalance would eventually lead to permanent division. In 395, following the death of Emperor Theodosius, the empire was split between his two sons, Honorius ruling the west from Milan and later Ravenna, and Arcadius ruling the east from Constantinople. This division, initially intended as administrative convenience, became permanent as the two halves followed increasingly divergent paths. The 5th century in the West was a period of accelerating collapse. The frontiers, increasingly permeable, admitted not just raiding parties, but entire peoples seeking refuge from the Huns, a nomadic confederation that had erupted out of Central Asia and was destroying everything in its path. In 410, Visigoths under their king Alaric sacked Rome itself, the first time in 8 centuries that foreign enemies had breached the city's walls. The psychological impact was immense. Rome, the eternal city, symbol of civilization and power, had fallen to barbarians. Though the sack was relatively brief and limited, and Rome was no longer the capital of the Western Empire, the event shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. Subsequent decades brought further disasters. The Vandals conquered North Africa, depriving the Western Empire of its primary grain source and much of its tax revenue. Britain was abandoned as Roman administration collapsed and Saxon raiders became settlers. Gaul and Spain came increasingly under the control of various Germanic kingdoms that nominally acknowledged Roman authority, but in practice acted independently. The Western imperial government, reduced to Italy and fragments of other provinces, became increasingly irrelevant. Real power lay with military commanders, often of barbarian origin, who made and unmade emperors with casual brutality. These emperors, with few exceptions, were incompetent figureheads unable to command loyalty, raise revenues, or field effective armies. The Senate, that ancient institution that had once directed Rome's conquests, still met in Rome, its members wearing their traditional insignia, but it was a hollow shell, its deliberations concerning only local matters, while the fate of the empire was decided by force in distant regions. The collapse, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. In 476, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a boy with a mockingly ironic name evoking both Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needed its own emperor, and ruled Italy as a barbarian king nominally subject to the Eastern emperor. This moment, more a formality than a dramatic break, is conventionally marked as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Yet in many ways, Roman civilization continued. The Eastern Empire, which historians would later call the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years, maintaining Roman law, administration, and culture, even as it became increasingly Greek in language and Christian in character. In the West, the barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman authority largely preserved Roman institutions, employed Roman administrators, maintained Roman law for their Roman subjects, and sought legitimacy through association with Roman imperial traditions. The Catholic Church, headed by the Bishop of Rome, preserved Latin learning, maintained networks that spanned the former empire, and gradually converted the barbarian kingdoms to Christianity, creating a new form of unity based on shared religion rather than political authority. The roads, aqueducts, bridges, and buildings the Romans had constructed remained, many still in use, shaping the landscape and influencing settlement patterns for centuries. The Latin language evolved into the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, while Latin itself remained the language of learning, law, and religion throughout the Middle Ages. Roman law, codified by the Eastern Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, became the foundation for legal systems across Europe. In the landscape itself, the traces remained. Aqueducts, their arches marching across valleys, stood empty but intact, marvels of engineering that no one now living could replicate. Roads, still paved with their original stones, continued to carry traffic, though reduced to a trickle compared to the busy commerce of earlier centuries. Cities, though much diminished in population and with large areas abandoned, maintained some continuity of habitation, their forums now markets, their basilicas converted to churches, their baths quarried for building stone. In the countryside, the great estates that had dominated agriculture in the late empire gradually transformed into the manners of the medieval period, maintaining patterns of land ownership and agricultural organization that had Roman origins. The very hills and valleys, shaped by centuries of Roman cultivation, terracing, irrigation, and deforestation, bore the mark of Roman environmental impact, even as forests reclaimed abandoned fields and marshes returned to areas that Roman drainage had once kept dry. As night falls once more over those 7 hills where Rome began, we return to the present, carrying with us glimpses of a civilization that shaped the world in ways both obvious and subtle. The rise and fall of the Roman Empire was not the work of heroes or villains, not a simple story of triumph and tragedy, but rather the accumulated result of countless decisions made by millions of individuals over more than a millennium. It was farmers plowing fields and soldiers building roads, merchants shipping goods, and slaves toiling in quarries, senators debating in the forum and women managing households, engineers designing aqueducts, and priests performing sacrifices. It was the product of favorable climate and geographic position, of institutional flexibility and cultural adaptability, of military power and economic integration. Its fall, similarly, resulted from multiple factors converging over centuries: political instability and economic decline, military challenges and climatic changes, demographic pressures and pandemic diseases, none alone sufficient to destroy so vast an enterprise, but together, overwhelming the structures that had sustained it. The legacy, however, endured. In the languages we speak, the laws we follow, the roads we travel, the buildings we construct, and the very concept of what it means to be civilized, Rome's influence persists. The empire fell, but the idea of Rome, the dream of universal order, rational administration, and shared culture transcending ethnic and regional boundaries, survived, inspiring emulations and revivals for the next 1,500 years and continuing to shape Western civilization into the present day. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, perhaps you can still hear, faintly, the echo of footsteps on ancient stone, the murmur of voices in the forum, the splash of water in a fountain, the distant roar of a crowd in an amphitheater, the sounds of a world that was, yet somehow remains, woven into the fabric of our own.